All right, welcome everyone to our NYPAPy hour. It is the end of what has been a very long and tough week out there for a lot of us. So I don't know about you, but I'm very glad to be here. It's really great to see everyone. And if you happen to have a beverage of your choice handy, I would encourage you to hoist it aloft at this time and join me in a toast to George McAneny. Cheers. Now, Adrian, I'm going to unmute you, and where's Lucie? Get you unmuted as well so that we missed our opportunity to clink glasses there as we launch into tonight's happy hour. But my name is Brad Vogel, and I'm not normally wearing a cowboy hat with a picture of George McAneny behind me, but my hair has grown quite long over these months, and I've been told by one Ted Minot that sometimes the background photo will sort of eat away at one's head if you don't do something. So we've got a protective cowboy halo on this evening. So thanks, Ted, for the pointer. I work for the New York Preservation Archive Project, and we work tirelessly to make sure that the story of the many, many preservationists in New York City gets told. And there's one sort of grand arcing story, and there are many little stories. George McAneny is interesting because he has his own individual story as a preservationist that we're going to get into tonight, but he is also woven in so many different ways with that broader, grand arcing story of preservation, not only in New York City, but also nationally across the United States. So get ready for tonight's programming because it is going to be a really interesting look at the preservation world or preservation story from a variety of different perspectives. I also wanted to thank our program sponsor for tonight, which is Jan Herd Picorni Associates. So thank you for helping make this possible and helping carve out enough time and financial support for NYPAP to put on this program. And let me introduce you to two people who are going to be chatting with me tonight, who have, in their own ways, become experts on facets of George McAneny, a many-faceted man. First, I want to introduce you to someone you may well know, Adrian Untermyer, an urbanist, preservationist, and former deputy director of the Historic Districts Council. He recently curated Magnificent Mr. McAneny, an exhibition at Federal Hall showcasing the life and legacy of George McAneny, and delivered the inaugural McAneny Lecture at Federal Hall, where he released a plan to fix Penn Station using McAnany's planning and preservation principles. So we'll get into that a little bit more, but welcome, Adrian.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
You, I must say, Adrian, are the first person in the course of this series to use that response. So congrats.
First and last.
We shall see. Lucie, we'll see if you deign to join Adrian in that greeting. But Lucie Levine is a historian, tour guide, and freelance writer. I will also say she is a great trivia host as well. So don't let that slip. That's another important skill. As a member of Friends of George McAneny, she worked with NYPAP and MAS to create a tour of George McAneny's New York. Now, this was back in the time when one could take an actual walking tour with a group and go around and see the sights. Some elements of those have actually been worked into an urban archive tour that you can take as well. So you can check out that app to get a little George McAneny fix after this show. She has also written about McAneny's role in the development of Greater New York for the Gotham Center for New York City History. Welcome, Lucie.
Thank you. I am also very happy to be here.
Oh!
And I will tell the crowd that what Brad is not bragging about when it comes to trivia is that he actually won one of my trivia games. So Brad thinks I'm good at trivia, but he is too. So
It was only one round, so more rounds to go, for sure. All right. Well, I wanted to mention one other person before we get underway here, someone who has been instrumental in lifting up the legacy of George McAneny, and that is Kay Siganovic. Kay, would you like to unmute and say a word or two?
Hey, I'm nappy to be here too.
Fantastic.
I'm kind of twisted, but I'm so thrilled to see so many people being involved, and to Brad and Lucie and Adrian, I'm so grateful for what you're doing today. to kind of talk a little bit about George and what it did. So I appreciate it. Thank you so much and welcome everybody.
Wonderful, and thank you, Kay. And Kay has helped in so many ways to make what really last year was called the Year of McAneny happen. And that year has really sort of expanded into this year. And we have someone working with us at NYPAP named Luis Diaz, who is on the line. He is our McAneny scholar, and he was conducting research in archives until that became pretty much impossible, and has now started to shift to helping us get things online about George McAneny, because as I said before, there are so many facets to the man. So Luis, please welcome. Feel free to say a word or two.
Hi everyone, NYPAPy here to see you as well. Yeah, the past couple months have been staying and chatting at the same time to see how to shift from a solely on-site form of research to more of a digital version. Hopefully I'll have the opportunity to get back out and learn a lot more so I can share with you all.
Thank you so much. Okay, let's get into it. I am going to, here we go. Helen, what are we saying here in the comments? Be sure to enable the video option. Helen, how are you doing? All set, thumbs up, excellent. Okay, now, along with my guests this evening, we're going to go through some slides. The slides, of course, are just to help illustrate things, and it's really about the conversation. So look forward to giving you some insights into magnificent Mr. McAneny. One moment here. Okay. And just to make sure, Adrian, are you seeing the first slide?
I sure am.
Of what I will note is a very crowd-pleasing, bearded version of George McAneny. So,
Dashing man.
So who was George McAneny in a nutshell? Adrian, what's the most salient thing that comes to mind for you when you think of George McAneny?
The most salient thing, aside from the beard, is a hunger to make change and an evolution in how he accomplished it. And I think today when we have these 4 crises, I mean, it really is a hydra of crises: public health, racial justice, democracy, and of course, the mental health consequences of dealing with all of that. It often feels like we don't have any tools at our disposal for dealing with all of this. But George was living in a very similar time. He lived through World War II. He lived through a pandemic. And he certainly subscribed to the Rahm Emanuel proposition that we should never let a crisis go to waste. So he's dapper, sure. He's well-educated. I'm sure he was kind and interesting, although none of us really had much of a chance to find out. But I think he would have seized the day, and I just want to urge everybody to seize this day and this moment as well.
Okay. Let me just make sure that we are actually recording here. It looks like we are, but 1 second here. Just make absolutely certain we're not missing this. We are recording. Great. Okay. We have had an issue before, and I just wanted to make doubly sure. All right. Moving right along. So Kay, who you heard from earlier, is actually one of the descendants of McAneny. Now, in this image, clearly we are not looking, and we have some other family members from the McAneny clan on as well. So we'll get to a little more insight later directly from some of those folks. But this is a picture that's clearly not George McAneny on the Gowanus Canal, I will tell you that much. I'm quite certain is up at Lake George. But we're looking at McAneny at a point that, from what I can tell, early in his career as a public figure. He started out as a journalist, and he then started to dip his toes into the civic sector. And one of his major influences and mentors was Carl Schurz, who was sort of an all-around civic figure at the time. And you begin to see McAneny moving into this civic sector as someone who is known as an exponent of reform. Would you say that's fair, Lucie?
Yes, absolutely. What's so amazing about McAneny having held as many posts as he did, is that we sometimes don't think about McAneny as being involved in the actual writing of statutes very, very early on in his career, but actually he was. So one of the first statutes that he actually wrote, he wrote the New York State Civil Service Reform Law itself. He co-authored it in 1899. So when we talk about civil service reform, not only was he part of good government in a really substantial way, but he really wrote it into the sort of laws and statutes of the city itself.
Got it. Okay. So McAneny is interesting though, because what I find in the pictures that have come down to us, there's this real sense of humanity. This is not a person who is only a public facade, and that public facade has sort of become them. It seems that there is always this real human being behind. And what I can tell, and in my research, actually, I'm just going to stop and ask whoever is unmuted with, sounds like a little child in the background, if you could just mute yourself. And I will actually go back and mute everyone again, except for our speakers. There we go. All right. There we go. But you can see how that actually seems to influence McAneny's attempt to make New York City a livable city, a human-scaled city, which again, of course, is such a big priority for so many people these days. But you can see that it's in McAneny as an actual human being, and he takes on so many different roles. I mean, for one, he gets involved with Penn Station. Adrian, what's this all about?
Well, some people advocated for saving Penn Station. McAneny advocated for creating the original thing. And he did that as what some people call a government affairs professional and other people call a lobbyist. But the results were breathtaking. The process getting there, less so. It, of course, was a site that was occupied by real human beings who had to be displaced. And, of course, real human beings were killed in the tunnels underneath. And other real human beings were very sad when the building was demolished. But when it went up, it was a temple of transit. It was the type of building project that New York really was not familiar when it came to seeing. And the first day, just thousands and thousands of people just visiting to see it, even though they couldn't really go anywhere. McAneny was at the core of that, and it gave him a lesson when it came to how does planning work? How does dealing with various constituencies work? And the fact he got that on the front end of his career rather than the back end as some sort of an accomplished professional, he had insight that a lot of others really didn't have. And he took that with him as he started to become more and more prolific over those years. I mean, the zoning resolution, it passes in it's the zoning resolution of 16. Penn Station opened in 1910. So very, very close in time working on massive, massive projects, but always with that sort of backdoor view. And he did some relatively controversial things with that knowledge, right? We're going to talk a little bit later about how, he widened 7th Avenue to accommodate a new subway. You might liken him to Robert Moses because widening means demolishing buildings and this and that. But, by the same token, he wasn't building an expressway with a non-human scaled city. He was building a subway to the Upper West Side, building a subway network that stretches to the Upper East Side, building a subway network that stretches out to the boroughs, all with the mind of having streets with sidewalks and trees and dense housing. People are getting very scared in this COVID moment of the McAneny model, but people have loved New York for generations, and I think people will continue to love it precisely for those reasons.
Right. Now, it's very interesting. Adrian, I flashed an image from your presentation about to fix Penn Station, think smaller. So hopefully we will have some time in the Q&A session to get into a little bit of that. But we've moved up to another image here, and I thought Lucie might want to chime in, especially because Adrian mentioned the widening of 7th Avenue, as well as the great expansion of the subways that happened under McAneny's leadership. So Lucie, how does the subways and the avenue widening in the village on 7th Avenue, how do those tie together?
the reason that McAneny widened 7th Avenue, and in fact was involved not only in the widening of 7th Avenue, but the extension of 7th Avenue, what we now call 7th Avenue South, and the widening of Varick Street to meet it, was to make an artery south through Manhattan for the 7th Avenue subway. As he's looking at this extraordinary subway expansion, he was Manhattan Borough President during the time of what's called the dual contracts, which added over 300 miles of subway to the existing New York City subway system and gave us really the subway system as we understand it. And when I say that he was Manhattan Borough President during that time, I mean not only that that was his office, but that it was his baby, in the sense that it was his ability to broker those contracts, those dual contracts that gave us the subway itself. And it's so interesting to talk about the subway during our own COVID moment, because it really is born in a lot of ways out of a public health crisis. The good government part of civil service reform in New York City was really involved in dealing with what they saw as the congestion problem, particularly in New York's most densely populated areas, so particularly in the Lower East Side. And what they realized, and they would have these really incredible exhibitions, like in 1907 they had the congestion show, and it was a way of showing members of the public what it meant to sort of get out of these very, very dense confines of New York City and to develop a larger city, a greater New York. So we get greater New York in 1898. And McAneny really comes of political age at that moment. And he realizes, okay, we go from a city of 1.4 million to a city of 3.4 million, essentially overnight. How do we connect that city? How do we make a greater New York? And he realizes it's really going to be with the expansion of the subway. So we get the subway in 1904, and he expands it really in 1913, which is when we have the dual contracts. And so what I think is so interesting to see about that when we're talking about the expansion of 7th Avenue is that we're really talking about the expansion of New York itself, of greater New York, and taking people out of what could be considered to be a hazardous area like an overpopulated Lower East Side, and with the subway creating a much larger space. So along subway lines, you could develop the city of New York, and you could have more parkland, you could have wider homes, and then with that, as Adrian mentions, McAneny will become the father of zoning in this country in 1916. And so the idea of once you build this larger city, how do you then make it livable? And so with that will come preservation. And that's so interesting too, is those are McAneny's, he's doing the dual contracts, but I think of him as a sort of a dual planner and preservationist. So he starts out with all these plans and larger, and he's, expanding the subway, expanding 7th Avenue. But then once you've expanded this city, how do you keep it livable? How do you keep it human scale? And that he'll do through zoning.
Right. Now it's interesting to talk about some of these places where there were sort of overcrowded places, because I often think about when I'm reading from episodes from this period, what would Jane Jacobs think about this description of a neighborhood or as a place as being excessively crowded? And would she simply see this as a pretext for bringing in a sort of city beautiful style grand design and plunking it down on what had otherwise organically grown up? So I do think there's always this complicating factor when we look back at a site like Penn Station and we lament the loss of that building. And then sometimes we forget to look back further. As Adrian said, people lived there. There was a Tenderloin neighborhood there that was densely populated and chiefly with African Americans. So sort of at what point do you choose on the circle to draw your tangent when you're looking back? And I think, one thing that we do at NYPAPy, and I think increasingly is becoming part of the way that people look at history, is to keep finding a way to look at more of the tangents on the circle and make sure that we're not focusing solely on one aspect of things. And in digging into the legacy of McAneny, just based on how many things he was involved with, it's unbelievable. You actually have reason to look at a lot of those tangents. And so I'm going to move us on to our next image here. This is him at his desk as Borough President. And I wanted to mention, you know, his work as the Gale brewer of his time, if you will. I mean that with all sorts of respect and honor. You also have to talk a little bit about something Lucie alluded to, and sort of where the Lower East Side meets what is now the Civic Plaza and Foley Square. And, you know, McAneny worked a little bit to save City Hall and City Hall Park because there was a push there to basically build what is now the municipal building. So if I'm going to take this little pen here in blue, and you can see sort of this arrow, this points beyond the courthouse, and if you follow that way just a little bit, you'd be at the giant, what is it, 1913, 1914 municipal building. If that complex had been built where some had originally intended it, it would have demolished the Tweed Courthouse, for one, but it would have also dramatically overshadowed City Hall and also radically changed City Hall Park. So McAneny had a hand in securing funds to restore City Hall, which was already 100 years old at that time, and then also in creating Foley Square. Now, Adrian, I know you could probably give us a little bit on Foley Square, but I think one thing I wanted to mention before we do that is it required the demolition of all kinds of buildings to get there. So, you know, today we have many wonderful, you know, an edifice after edifice around Foley Square, but it was also something that, again, like some of these other civic advancement projects, required demolitions.
Yeah, and you know, this is an emotional picture to look at for me because a lot of memories in my life are on this square. I worked in the courthouse that we're staring at on the left, of course, the Supreme Court for New York County, and I see John Werner is on the line, the venerable former chief clerk in the civil branch, who spent many, many years trying to make things as good as possible for litigants. And to the right, we have Cass Gilbert's gorgeous U.S. courthouse, now home to the Second Circuit. And this square really does epitomize what justice means in America. It's literally what you see at the beginning of Law and Order, but it also epitomizes the downside of the American justice system. And I think those sides of the coin, I mean, I'm holding the George McAneny Challenge coin right now. It has two sides, right? And we do have to acknowledge that there were demolitions. And we do have to wonder, yes, we got beautiful architecture out of it. And as someone who submitted the rejected proposal to the Landmarks Commission for a courthouse district, I love the pretty buildings. But what happened in those buildings, right? Central Park 5 tried in the LaSalle modernist courthouse just above at the site of Old Collect Pond Park. Until we have a justice system that matches that aesthetic, then the demolitions, many could argue, would be in vain. But I still love Foley Square. And when the protesters came out recently, where did they go to? They gravitated to Foley Square because that is the locus of what progress aspirationally means in this country, even though it doesn't actually exist. So McAneny is a complicated figure, doubtlessly. He's holding a saw over my shoulder, hacking down a building, quite literally, right? But we got to take the good with the bad, and we have to be mature as preservationists. I'm reminded of a memory of mine at the Prospect Expressway out in Brooklyn, an expressway that hacked through a dense neighborhood. And I took a picture of a beautiful Art Deco detail on that amazing Prospect Expressway, which disrupted lives and is disrupting lives to this day. So we have to be able to see both sides of that coin. We have to be able to understand the ambiguity and be comfortable with the fact that these tensions are not going to resolve.
Right. Yeah, no, it's a very, very well stated, Adrian. And, you know, one other part of that is also to step back from the normative question and also simply acknowledge George McAneny had an incredible influence on the course of the city and on the built environment that we still enjoy today, or that we see as definedly part of New York City today. The 1916 zoning resolution alone, which was really the start of zoning in the United States in any significant way. So many of the classic New York skyscrapers and buildings that we know today, the ziggurat or the sort of wedding cake style where they step back from the street, that is directly a response to the 1916 zoning resolution. So much of what has really come to be quintessential New York architecture or New York skyline, you know, traces back to George McAneny. All right, now let's move right on along here. And what do we have here? Oh, here's the Tweed Courthouse. It has its own complicated story, that is for sure. But it is hard to deny that it's not a, you know, that's a good looking building in its classical way. And with its gigantic windows, I will say. And then Francis Tavern. Now, Lucie, this, you know, George McAneny, to my knowledge, was not directly involved in any particular way with Francis Tavern, but we've included it here because Lucie brought up a great point about how George McAneny lived through a very important progress or transformation in how Americans looked at and practiced historic preservation. So Lucie, did you want to get into that a little bit?
Sure, and I think it's really great to put this on the heels of Foley Square, because the question in McAneny's life was essentially like, where are we going to build these courthouses? And some people were saying, let's build them directly in City Hall Park, and some people were saying, let's not. And McAneny came up with this idea of Foley Square specifically so that he would not have to put them in City Hall Park, and that's because he came of age during a time of thinking about landmarks and preservation that's really different from the way that we think about it now. So at the turn of the 20th century, there certainly wasn't a landmarks law. We didn't get one until 1965 in New York City, but there was some impetus toward preservation, and to the degree that there was, it was really about isolated structures that were not really part of the streetscape at all, but were memorials to a Republican ideal. And by Republican, I don't mean the Republican Party, I mean the Republic. So it was like a way of honoring what were considered to be sort of civic buildings that were related really to the founding of the Republic. Of course, Francis Tavern being a prime example. Francis Tavern was the original, you might even call it the original municipal building, because the original departments of war, finance, and foreign affairs were headquartered there. George Washington, of course, when he gave his farewell address to his troops on December 4th, 1783, he will give it on the second floor of that building. And Francis Tavern loves to say that, but it's really only the bones of this building that are original. In fact, in 1906, it was actually reconstructed by the Sons of the American Revolution. So what we're looking at, Francis Tavern calls that the oldest standing structure on the island of Manhattan, but really it's not. Or only its bones are, only the most sort of core of the structure is, and the rest of it is reconstruction. And so in 1906, this idea of sort of reconstructing a past was part and parcel of historic preservation. It wasn't what we think of now when we are champion of like the streetscape, you know, and sort of buildings being integrated into the life of the city is something that we celebrate Jane Jacobs for that, but really that starts with George McAneny, I would argue. But the reason it's so interesting to talk about this on the heels of Foley Square is that George McAneny certainly was involved in the sort of preservation of the sense of City Hall Park. City Hall itself had already been saved. It was going to be, there was consideration of demolishing it, but it had already been saved before McAneny comes to the fore. But the question is, like, do we want to put these courthouses in and around City Hall Park? And McAneny essentially says no, because it was this idea of preserving the green space as it would have looked, quote unquote, when City Hall itself was built in 1811. But this idea of it just being this sort of pristine way of honoring the Republic. In fact, City Hall Park was never pristine in that way if we're looking at real history, because it was originally the Commons, and so there was a gallows there was an almshouse, there was a hospital there. There was all this kind of history that wasn't the history of the Republic in a way, but when we talked about preservation at the turn of the century, it was really about the preservation of the Republic.
Right, patriotic structures of some kind, right? Yeah. So let's roll right along here and see what we have next. Oh, now this, we were talking about George McAneny in the 19 teens, and he's doing all kinds of things. I don't think that we will do an adequate job here of conveying to you just how many different hats this man wore. It was top hats, it was straw hats, it was, but, physical hats aside, we're talking about many, many different civic and public roles. He is working as a managing editor at one point for the New York Times. He is working on a state transportation committee. He is the first head of the Regional Planning Association. He is, the president of the Board of Aldermen. He is all over the place. But one thing that I did not know until I got involved with the Friends of McAneny was that he also served on the Board of Trustees of Tuskegee Institute. And you can see Booker T. Washington there on the steps, and McAneny is two individuals down. So he really, truly was this very interesting person. And he's also there when I believe it's the first transatlantic call is made, 1915 or so. Just a really interesting person who was very much a part of his times in all kinds of different ways. So I encourage you to check out any of the resources on our website, which is www.nypap.org. We have all kinds of stuff about McAneny, including a monograph by Charles Starks, who's a great researcher who's really dived in and taken a look at some of his work. So this picture is him up at Columbia University for the unveiling of the Thomas Jefferson Monument. So I wanted to put these two images together at this particular moment in time, just given sort of the interesting racial overtones or undertones that one might see, both working in a sort of practical way with Booker T. Washington on one front, and on the other, unveiling a statue of Thomas Jefferson, who has his own complicated racial history. So he really was, and this is us in many ways taking a contemporary lens and looking back on things. At the time, I don't know if those lenses would have necessarily been applied, but I wanted to throw these out there again, just to show you how many sides there are to George McAneny for you to go out and explore and uncover and dig further into. Now what is this? You can see, if you're looking closely here, and let me get out our handy dandy little pen here. And which color should I use? How about green? Look at this. St. John's Chapel. Now, I hope we are halfway through our program, because this is the fulcrum. This is what I think is the tipping point when we are looking at the question of how did George McAneny become a preservationist? Now, I don't know if either of you want to dive in on this one particularly, but it does tie into transit, it ties into street widening, it ties into historic structures. This is a very New York story. This is like a microcosm of a New York problem, you might say. Lucie, you're smiling. I feel like you have a thought on this.
All right. I think we all have something to say about this, but this is St. John's Chapel. And it is part of our 7th Avenue and Varick story, right? So when George McAneny is sort of laying the tracks for the subway, it's this question of like, okay, how do we expand our city and save it at the same time? And I would argue that George McAneny is the first person to really confront that question head on, because he's the first preservationist that I can think of who was also a planner, who was doing two roles, that he was trying to expand the city and also trying to save it at the same time. And as Brad mentioned, like, this really brings him to saving the city, because he'll have to destroy this, or he won't have to, he'll actually try to save it, but he will, and it will get destroyed in the course of his work. So he's laying track for the subway, and he's expanding both Varick Street and 7th Avenue South. And this stood really kind of at the crux, the intersection of those two widenings. And it was actually owned by Trinity Church, and you know, McAneny, I think, takes a lot of flack for this being destroyed, but Trinity Church itself did not want this chapel anymore, because the beautiful people in New York City were kind of like moving on up from this place, and they were not using it as much. And so Trinity was planning to have it bulldozed anyway. But preservationists said, wait, this is designed by John McComb, the same man who designed City Hall. And again, you know, it being that type of preservation. So preservation of these monuments of the Republic. So the architect of the Republic in New York City at that time, I would argue, was John McComb. And so it was like, all right, we have to save this particular chapel. And McAneny, because I see him as a deal maker, he was able to make a deal about the dual contracts and the expansion of the subway. He was also able to make a deal about this, and it looked like it was going to get saved. He said to Trinity, okay, I will create a group of people who will raise the money to save this particular chapel, but you have to be willing to keep the deed and run it for 2 more years. And Trinity said, okay. And everything was all set, 1916, and it doesn't work. It actually gets demolished, because what happens to George McAneny? He puts on a new hat and he gets out of government at exactly that time, and he goes to be managing editor of the New York Times. And nobody else had the finesse that McAneny had to make this deal work. And so the deal falls through, and this gets demolished. And it's a very, you know, it was painful for the city, because it was this beautiful monument. And I think it was a moment for McAneny where he said, wow, like, as we're building out, as we have this greater New York, this bigger and bigger city, which in a way is really good, because of what he saw as, you know, this congestion issue and this public health issue, and how do we make a bigger, healthier, more livable city. But then that question of being, what does it mean if livability means, you know, destroying what he called the old places?
Right,
you know,
right. Right. No, thank you so much for laying that out. Adrian, what are your thoughts on this this compromise proposal?
Well, I would love if you could just go to the prior slide, picturing him at the Jefferson unveiling, because when a lot of people see Jefferson, they think currency. I think Sally Hemings. But currency is something that Mr. Jefferson is pictured on. And of course, if I'm not mistaken, I've never seen this photo before, but it looks like J.P. Morgan is to the left of McAneny there, so of course, slouching in his chair and got a grumble on his face. And he is, of course, the personification of currency in that era, so much so that he guaranteed the United States of America. But George McAneny's currency, again, back to the coin thing, I'm on a theme tonight, his currency, it was those personal relationships. And he actually did somewhat hatch this unsuccessful plan to preserve St. John's. And as Lucie says, he leaves and no one else really has that currency. And so I think it just underscores the fact that all of us here tonight as preservationists, or maybe people who are becoming preservationists this evening for the first time, we really need to rely on those relationships, especially now when person-to-person contact is sort of off limits.
Right.
That's his stock in trade.
Right. Yeah. And it's so interesting to look at this, because if we go to our next rather sobering image here, this is the result. Now, the compromise, as Lucie had alluded to, was to, and I'm going to get out my pen here, and let's go with a lovely yellow. And this portico here, the plan was to widen the street as needed, but then keep the portico in place here and sort of dip a sidewalk under the portico, as I understand it. And that was the compromise. So this portico was going to butt out into what otherwise was sort of an expanded right-of-way bumped out, but would, in the compromise, allow a way for pedestrians to sort of go down under this, and that would serve as the sidewalk. Now, that clearly didn't work, but when does this demolition actually take place? When does this sort of failure for the compromise to come through actually happen? Very interestingly, it happens during the throes of the 1918 Spanish flu epidemic. So, another weird echo of, to our own current day times. Oh, who is this? Where, most importantly for our audience tonight, where has the beard gone? Now, can anyone in the chat tell us where this speech is occurring? And Lucie and Adrian, Kay, don't say anything.
We're keeping our mouths shut.
Okay.
Federal
Dang
Hall.
it, Lewis got it on the first. Okay, we've got some intelligent people on the line this evening. Yes, Federal Hall. Now, keep that in mind because Federal Hall may come up again when we're talking about McAneny. But this is actually an image of George McAneny as the chairman of the board of the World's Fair of 1939, kicking off the festivities. And now this was, Lucie or Adrian, remind me here, we're talking about you always have to come up with a reason, a sort of historical justification for having a World's Fair. And, I think the Chicago Columbian Exposition was an anniversary of Columbus's arrival. And this, 1939, is sort of an odd year. Why in the world are we having a World's Fair? I think this was this the sesquicentennial of Washington's swearing in? Is that right? I'm certainly open to either of you or anyone in the comments here contradicting me, but I think they had to get a little bit arcane to come up with their justification for that particular World's Fair.
Well, from what I've seen in the record, McAneny, again, subscribing to that old Rahm Emanuel quote from the recession of 08, he sort of latched the preservation of Federal Hall onto this wonderful World's Fair in a bunch of patriotic whatever. But one suspects that the man really just cared about Federal Hall and could have cared less about whatever happened at the exposition. But the fact remains, he's in front of that statue of George Washington that we all know up in the front of Federal Hall National Memorial in Lower Manhattan on Wall Street. He's overlooking the expanse on the right of the New York Stock Exchange, of course, the Cathedral of Commerce when you talk about the United States of America. And if I have my geography right, and I may not, to the left, once again, J.P. Morgan, where his house of banking was for all of those years. And here's George McAneny wearing a top hat and a long coat with NBC microphones, WNYC, of course, then the city-owned station broadcasting in New York, proclaiming something worth proclaiming to this crowd. Now, the soldiers in the background and the kid near that column don't look too enthused, but this is what he did. He spoke truth wherever he could go. And, I've been looking for times where he was dead flat wrong, times where there's no argument to be made, in terms of, what he's supporting. I haven't seen it yet, right? He's usually pretty much on the money, and he's in the quarters of power, trying to make sure that the next society we have for our generation and all those afterwards are just a little more interesting, a little more inspiring. And he had his flaws, but boy, did he have his strengths.
Right. No, and I think one of the reasons, Adrian, that he always seems to be on the right side of things is that he was able to compromise and work with a wide swath of people. And I think that's why he ended up in so many of these positions, is that people found him to be an honest broker. They found him to be someone they could take at face value when he said something. And that seemed to serve him in good stead throughout his civic career. Let's move right on along here. And, oh, there it is. We have zoomed out. There is no more McAneny standing there in top hat, but we have George Washington. This, of course, building is not from the 1700s. This was not the building that stood on the site when Washington was actually sworn in. at his inauguration. This, of course, was a sub-treasury building that came along later, related to customs, and dates to, I believe, the 1840s? 1842 is the date that's floating in my head. I see Lewis, our McAneny scholar, is serving as factotum of sorts here. So Lewis, feel free to chime in if you find the specific date for Federal Hall. And we'll see if you can get in there before one of our many wise commenters chimes in, who probably knows it by heart. But this is, of course, in sort of the Greek revival, classical revival era during that sort of period of the 1830s to the 1850s. But how does Federal Hall actually get saved?
I can answer that. I love the way that he does this because it really encapsulates the 1930s and what is going on in terms of both preservation and development in New York City, which is that he utilizes the federal government in a way, I would say, for the first time when it comes to preservation. He turns to the Historic Sites Act of 1935, and he realizes, oh my goodness, there's this New Deal money, and there's this New Deal legislation that will make it possible for me to save this building if I make it a federal building instead of one that is owned by the city and therefore has to be within the city budget. And so what's so brilliant is he says, oh, I don't need to ask Fiorello LaGuardia. You know, I can go, I would say directly to FDR, but actually he goes to Howard Ickles, who was the Secretary of the Interior at that time. And he says, you know, I want to make this federal land, and of course now it's a national park, and that's why that he's able to use the federal government. And the reason I think that's so interesting is because his foil in all of this is Robert Moses, right, is the power broker. And so Moses is appointed by LaGuardia, you know, as Parks Commissioner in 1933, and it's so interesting because this is actually the first time, not the first time, but certainly maybe the last time, right, the 1939 World's Fair that Moses and McAneny will be on the same page. Like, McAneny suggests the 1939 World's Fair to Robert Moses, and in the Power Broker, Kara writes that Robert Moses turns to George McAneny when he suggests the World's Fair, and he goes, "By God, that is a good idea," you know. And then they were never friends again. But in this moment, they were completely together on this. But the reason I mention it is because we write Robert Moses as this, you know, megalomaniacal sociopath who destroyed the lives of millions of people, who cared about cars more than people, you know, all this. But
wait, Lucie, is there a butt coming here?
But the only reason that he was able to do anything at all is that he had incredible amount of New Deal money and New Deal labor. New York City, in the first 2 years of the New Deal, got 1/7 of all New Deal funds. And so Robert Moses was able to run with that and build all this stuff. And so what I think is so interesting is that as Moses is like flattening neighborhoods throughout the city, McAneny is using those same New Deal funds really for the very first time for preservation, which is why I think Federal Hall is such an interesting place.
Right. And I mean, as far as I understand it, I think it was really also about his personal connection with the Secretary of the Interior, Harold Ickes, at the time. And that specific personal connection that really facilitated things. And Kay, I don't know if you have more insights on that, or Adrian, as to how that actually was facilitated, but that's my understanding from what I've read as to how narrowly the saving of this very prominent building came down to sort of the goodwill and the efforts of one person, which was George McAneny.
Yeah, Ickes is more than just a character in Annie, right? I mean, a person within the quarter of power, once again. The difficult thing when I look at Federal Hall, though, is that the last time I'd been at Federal Hall prior to our inaugural, our second George McAneny conference, bringing everybody together for the Friends, is that I had been at this thing for the National Trust, which of course McAneny was as well involved with creating. And it was all about this place matters, right? And having to remind people that this place, Federal Hall, matters. And for a lot of my friends and a lot of folks who visit Lower Manhattan, Federal Hall is a nice place to use the restroom, federally funded. And it's actually not where Washington took the oath of office. That was in a different building, right? But nevertheless, it persists. And, you know, in my life, I've eaten sandwiches at the base of that sculpture. I've used the restroom in Federal Hall, this and that. But I am very happy that we're breathing a little bit of life into the space by crediting the man who helped preserve it. And he did more than just help, right? But it's a fitting tribute to McAneny that we are invigorating Federal Hall with the memory of McAneny as we look to solve so many of the problems of this world according to his planning and preservation principles.
Absolutely. Now, what are we looking at here? Where is this lone figure wistfully standing? Do we have any guesses from the comments? There are some definite clues here in the skyline beyond this pile of rubble.
Bryant Park.
Okay, we're hearing some guesses, seeing some guesses. We are not at Penn Station. We are in Battery Park. You are correct there, but specifically, what are we in? Ah, there we go. Chuck and John Bacon with the answer, Castle Clinton. Now, isn't this an interesting perspective? Because this is not the view you usually see, which is this big, robust walls, coastal fortification remnants, or a picture of the building as it had been modified to be the aquarium at the tip of the island. This is a view from inside Castle Clinton after the aquarium portion of it, because of course Castle Clinton served many different things over time. It has had many lives. It is one very long-lived cat. But it always lands on its feet, and we are grateful for that. In this view, you're seeing the interior, you're seeing those massive walls after they've torn out all of the fish tanks and all the other accoutrements that made up the aquarium within the walls, and you're just seeing these ancient walls. So, and you're seeing, someone mentioned the custom house. That's what we're seeing here. This, and let me just get my, what color shall we use now? How about a lovely magenta? Here we go. Here's the customs house. And so you're looking off in this direction, you're looking at Wall Street over here, in Wall and Broad. So I think the place where McAneny really digs in his heels and really works every last connection he has and becomes part of this sort of band of preservationists is this fight, which is the fight to save Castle Clinton from Robert Moses. This is a knockdown, drag-out, decade-long fight. And everybody and their uncle gets involved in this fight at some point or another if they are a preservationist at this time.
They do. And, you know, I spoke about my memories at Foley Square earlier when we were looking at that photograph, and I see Mosette Broderick on the call. And one of my my favorite memories at Foley Square is underneath in the subway station where we were getting off the number 6 train, and she says, come on, get on the express. So we could go down and look at the beautiful landscape that we know is the Battery today. But, you know, people had loved Castle Clinton. They'd kind of forgotten about it, this and that. It was in the back of their heads. And then Moses hatches this plan to build a bridge along basically the path of the Battery tunnel. Now it's known as the Hugh Carey tunnel. But going from Lower Manhattan to Red Hook in Brooklyn, the plan had many iterations, but that was the basic idea. And, you know, it was pretty disgusting, right? I mean, think about losing that space to a gigantic bridge abutment, because bridges are not just the bridge part, it's all the serpentine ramps that make their way up there. And what I love most about this story is that McAneny ultimately prevails and saves the Battery Park and Castle Clinton that we know and love today, not to mention the views of Lady Liberty. He does that again through personal relationships. It's a long tale, but it eventually ends up with his relationship with Eleanor, that being Eleanor Roosevelt. And she appeals to Franklin, that being Franklin Roosevelt, who was the president of the United States at the time, and says, look, what is this Moses guy trying to do, especially with your money? And the rationale is concocted, at least according to Caro, that, you know, if the bridge had been bombed, there would be no way that the ships could make it to the Brooklyn Navy Yard. Again, as with my suspicions with Federal Hall, you know, maybe that was a convenient excuse for the feds to step in. But needless to say, we have Battery Park, we certainly have Castle Clinton, and we certainly have the views of the Statue of Liberty. And although I wish a lot of people in our society would look at Lady Liberty a lot more and remember what she represents, the view is there and waiting for them whenever they are ready. And that is thanks to George McAneny.
Mm-hmm. Now, to be clear, this is another example where McAneny worked with a band of civic figures. We had C.C. Cupp Burlingame, we had Albert Bard, who later would work on the Bard Act, which would actually allow New York City to have a landmarks law. You had all sorts of people who were sort of preservationists / civic figures. And in some ways, it was a little bit more of a group of the sort of civic gentry in a way. It was people who had means and influence and connections who all banded together. And so in some ways, not quite the same as some of the later preservation battles that we see sort of Penn Station onward, where it starts to become more of a grassroots movement that goes to sort of a mass level of opposition rather than relying solely on civic gentry as they're connected. But of course, as has been mentioned here, once you have Eleanor Roosevelt writing references to this in her column and, you know, whispering to people here and there, you begin to step outside of just the civic gentry, and this has become, you know, sort of a mass issue for people. So that's one that there is so much on our website that I can't even begin to download all the specific web links for you, but just type in Castle Clinton on our website and you will have reading for days on your tropical island. So, all right. Now this building, can anyone identify this structure? Lucie, I don't know from your work as someone who does trivia, if you know the Jeopardy theme, but I'm encouraging you to to bring it out right now if you do know. I'm eagerly. Yes. Okay. Mitchell comes through here. Yes.
Saved by the Grubler.
The National Gallery in DC. Now, why is this up here? This is not New York City. Why are we talking about this? Well, going hand in hand with McAneny's sort of shifting at the time of City Hall and St. John's Chapel, where you begin to see that he is not only about city beautiful planning that requires sort of demolition and destruction here and there, he also weaves in a recognition of the preservation interest in the public sphere. And he tilts even further then with the Castle Clinton fight and with Federal Hall. He is beginning to really see things as important when he senses that the development pace and interest in New York City will never go away. And so there has to be some countervailing force in the system. And you go from those two experiences to the next step, which I would argue is really the McAneny that you end up with after all of his many, many varied experiences in the civic sector. And that is George McAneny is one of the three men who sit down in this building in Washington, D.C. and hash out a plan to create the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And so you see McAneny taking the lessons from the urban environment in New York City and helping as one of several strands, admittedly, but one of several strands in launching a national organization that continues to this day to be an advocate for historic places and their preservation. So really it's kind of incredible to watch him unfold across about 5 decades or more. And I wanted, before we jump into Q&A proper here, I wanted to show this picture. Now, who is this? Now, Adrian, is this the sculpture you were talking about that's inside of Federal Hall that's on the wall there?
It sure is. And there's really only one marble plaque set into Federal Hall, and it's this one. And it reads, George McAneny, 1869 to 1953, pioneer in city planning, protector of historic places, leader of a city, and friend beyond compare. And friend beyond compare, I think, is exactly what we need to emphasize today. When I gave the George McAneny lecture, someone I love and trust came up to me and said, you know, what do we care about another old dead white guy? And the bottom line is we gotta call the shots as we see them. And McAneny knew how to use that precious currency, the currency of human relationships, to preserve what we love about New York and have the courage to say, hey, maybe this is a proposal that needs to happen and it will result in some demolitions, but it'll be greater later. And there are upsides and downsides of that, and we'll be debating them forever. And doubtlessly, graduate students will be writing theses about them forever. But the bottom line is we need more George McAneny's. And if I can leave all of you with anything this evening, it is think about his method. What was the McAneny method? It was get to know everybody, no matter how high a poobah or low a peon, and then talk to them. And don't just talk, listen, right? Listen to what they have to say, listen to their concerns, and much like a beautiful tapestry, weave it all together into a project that no one can come up with a good reason to say no to. So that is why George McAneny has this plaque, and that's why I hope that everybody, all 39 of you on this call tonight, and everybody within your networks, I hope that you all get plaques too in the future. Apply the McAneny method, make it your own, and use it to address all of those crises that we're dealing with today.
Well said, well said. Now, I am pulling out it's telling me it is the cyan colored pen here, and I'm going to indicate this young lady in the image. Now, who in the world could this be? I would like to ask this young lady to unmute herself and tell us a little bit more about this picture. Or I can unmute her. One moment. Let me just see here.
I got it.
Excellent.
Here we go. So that is a picture of me when I was 6 years old. And I was with George McAneny's wife, Marjorie, who we affectionately called Moo. And this was the unveiling of the plaque during his memorial. It was actually in 1956 when it was unveiled. Okay. And I can't remember the gentleman next to me, but obviously he was involved. There was a group of his friends who raised the money and got the permission from the National Park Service to put that plaque in Federal Hall.
Thank you so much, Kay. We really are just, again, grateful for all you've done to help lift McAneny up. Because unlike Robert Moses, and just to be clear, I may have sort of understated the nature of the Castle Clinton fight. At one point during one of the hearings, McAneny, who is an older gentleman by that time, comes out, gives his testimony, and others speak as well. And Robert Moses gets up and just launches in, no holds barred, and uses phrases, if I'm not mistaken, called him an exhumed mummy and an extinct volcano, among other things.
Right.
Now, if you ask me, it seems that some public figures, when they start assigning you a derogative name, it means they find that you're a threat. And so I feel like even in his old age, George McAneny was still recognized by Moses as someone who really had the capacity to bring a lot to bear in a civic fight. And so this is someone who really, who earned the words on that plaque in the city. Now, this is another picture. It's a little bit blurry, but it gives you the general idea. This is a group that Kay was really instrumental in starting several years back, which is the Friends of George McAneny. And it's been really fun to meet so many people through this group who come at George McAneny and his legacy through all these different ways. And Kay, if you want to say a little bit more about the group.
Okay, it's been an incredible few years of working with people who I never imagined I would work with before. The National Park Service has been especially helpful in getting us money and time and facilities to do programs. We've been involved with the Municipal Art Society, the New York Historical Society. I'm blanking on a lot of the other people, but then individuals as well who have are interested in architecture, preservation, planning, transit, everything, as you mentioned, that he was involved in. And we've been very successful with having many different projects going. And the exhibit that Adrian curated and put together is a traveling exhibit. So when we get to see each other again, we're looking forward to hopefully having it at the several different places in New York, as well as perhaps up in Lake George, so that people from Lake George can get to know him again as well.
Okay, thank you so much, Kay. And we're about to head into Q&A here, but before we do that, I just wanted to, for one moment, unmute everyone so you can give a round of applause to Kay for her efforts and to Lucie and to Adrian. So thank you all for joining us this evening. Really appreciate it. Okay.
Oh, I see you.
Oh, go right ahead, Kay.
Unmuted. I saw a question as to how I was related to him. He is my great-grandfather on my mother's side. And one of the things that especially means a lot to me is when my mother was pregnant with me, she was a single mom who had just gotten divorced, and Moo and Grandpa moved to Princeton out of New York so that I and my mother could live with them. So here we have two individuals in their 80s. Well, he was in his 80s, having a new baby, live with him, and we lived with them for about 1.5 years before my mom married my stepfather. And so he's always been a special person in my life.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's beautiful.
I
see we have a note here from Mitchell. Can Adrian say a bit about his ideas for Penn Station? So if you had to give us an elevator pitch, Adrian, for your ideas for how to fix Penn Station, what would it be?
Well, I went to Madison Square Garden to see a concert for the first time last summer. I had never been there before, and part of me thinks it was out of protest because I couldn't deal with what happened in those tortuous years in the early 60s where a phased demolition tore this magnificent monument to the ground.
But Billy Joel got the best of you?
Billy Joel, but what I did notice is that there were a lot of people there who have been having the time of their lives at Madison Square Garden forever. And there are many well-intentioned people out there who say that we should demolish Madison Square Garden and we should rebuild Penn Station as it existed. The governor of New York also says that we should demolish a full city block south of there. I think some of those solutions may end up unlearning the lesson at Penn Station, which is if somebody cares about a space, we gotta fix it in a way that doesn't impact others negatively. Mm-hmm. And the truth is, we have a lot of mid-century detail hiding in plain sight. We have a proven operations plan in that the way that Penn Station functioned back in the day, those elements are still there. They look a little different, but they're exactly the same today. And we have a moment right now where no one's going through there. Ridership is at 5% of what it was prior to COVID. And so my proposal is very simple. Unsnarl Penn Station by applying the McAneny method. And the McAneny method is this: listen to the ghosts of the past, do them justice, and ensure that you create a marvelous new monument that accommodates everything that's going on at the space today without disenfranchising folks, without ignoring their cries. And so the plan is pretty simple. It's at www.penncentral.us. But the bottom line is you take the proven operations flow, I call it the Penn Station Processional, where people would enter the facility, they would board from the level closest to the street, and they would exit using the level that was in between the tracks and the platforms. It was called the exit concourse for a reason. It was designed for exiting. But as Mosette knows on her trips out to Long Island, the whole complex feels like chaos because the exit concourse is used for exiting, the entrance concourse, this and that, and we have 3 railroads fighting over their particular scraps of turf. So I propose shutting the whole complex down for 1 month with a series of proven contingency plans. Shutting the place down, repairing it, including the tunnels that we need to repair anyway, or else someone's going to get impaled by another shard of metal, and paint it white to honor the ghostly past of that space. And then when you reopen it, arrange the tracks and platforms in a way that's logical, so it functions more like a subway station and less like a spaghetti bowl. Try saying that 3 times fast. And assigning platforms based on railroad's direction of travel. And then when it reopens, you have a marvelous new space with landmarks such as an information counter. I know that's controversial, but I think in a place like Penn Station, you should be able to get information about what you're navigating, and a museum to honor the history of what happened there in the waiting area that's there anyway. So when you're waiting for your train, you learn about historic preservation, because when I went to Penn Station before the lecture, I overheard some guy from Long Island saying, "Hey, I feel like there used to be a building here." And people shouldn't have to ask that question in 2020. And finally, a public piano, as I did at the Port Authority bus terminal, to inject a little bit of light and beauty and merriment into the space. It's a simple plan. It can be accomplished in a month. You can read it and critique it on your own, but I think now would be a great time to put it into action and to do Mackaninee justice.
Okay, thank you, Adrian. And I see we have a question here from Chuck Hovanek on, did McAneny balance his progressive ideals with the impacts his project sometimes had on vulnerable communities, Tenderloin, 5 Points, etc.? That is a big question, and I think there's a lot more work to be done on that. So we need to talk with Charles Starks, Adrian, Lucie, Kay, and I all need to get back to you on that, Chuck, I think. But right now, I can hear people already out the window, so it is 7 o'clock. If you need to get out there and clap or shout, stay safe this weekend, exercise your rights, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks to our speakers, and thanks again to Kay. Thank you, Lewis.
Thank you. Thank you
Take
for
care,
having us.
everyone.
Hi, Adrian.
Hi, Helen.
Hi, Adrian. Hi, Brad.
Helen, thank you.
So good to see you. Thank you for this. This was wonderful.
Speak up.
I want to say something. Can I say something?
You may.
Yeah. Okay. I'm Wendy McAneny Bradburn. I am now George McAneny's oldest grandchild. I have heard from Kay and followed all your stuff, but there's one good thing that COVID has done, which is to put this on Zoom so that I could attend this meeting, which I can't come to New York. And I would encourage you to do more with Zoom. I think that it's a great thing. I'm thrilled to see all the faces of the people whose names I've been reading. I think Kay's done a super job. I wish that more people could get involved through this kind of Zoom thing. So now that you know it's possible, I hope that maybe you'll use it more often.
Absolutely. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for being here, Wendy. We really appreciate it.
I've been very interested in this. I grew up with Robert Moses because every time Grandpa would come to Princeton to save the Princeton battlefield, I heard a lot about Moses.
Ah, interesting.
I was a sort of a, I wasn't paying all that much attention. It was a bit of a bore to a teenage kid. But I'm just so thankful and grateful that you are resuscitating this wonderful man.
Wonderful. Thank you again.
Please do consider Zooming more often.
Absolutely.
And thank you to all of you.
Thank you for joining us, and thank you for chiming in. I wish we would have had more time, but of course, these days we are hardbound to conclude at 7. So
McAneny deserves a part 2, Brad. I think Adrian will agree.
Yes, there's plenty
Think
more to
about
talk
he
about, that's for sure.
He's done so much. Thing is that how could you just isolate it to 1 hour? Like you could devote a whole month to everything he's done.
Yes, I think we will stay on Zoom for a month. All right, thank you so much. Take care, everyone.
Much appreciated, Brad, Kay, Lucy, everybody. Thank you,
Thank you.
especially Gail, too.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Brad.
Take care.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Kay.
Thank you. Wonderful seeing everyone. Thank you.